You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio. Welcome to the Bitter Medicine Podcast, where it's all about Black empowerment. Our show focuses on Black news and entertainment, arts, science, economics, history, people, and strategies that uplift, empower, and motivate Africans within the diaspora. And now, your host, whose favorite color is black, Goku.
Welcome back to the Bitter Medicine Podcast. I am your host, Goku. So we have some people in the chat room. Well, not in the chat room, but I see we have some people who are live with us already. Much appreciated to you guys who are live with us. Greetings. Go out to Black Excellence. Kevin K42 says, fire show last night. More please. Thank you for that, man. I appreciate it. And I see I already have some likes already inside the, for the video. So I appreciate all of that from you guys. If you are not aware, I did a show last night, pretty impromptu, a bit of a rant, a bit of an extended rant I did last night talking about this hashtag anti-Asian hate. And if you haven't checked that out, you guys make sure go and check that out. It was a good show, a good time was had. Even though it was an impromptu show, people did show up and we had a good discussion. I'd like to remind you guys that this show is a part of a podcast network called KWAZ Radio. The other shows on the network you should all know by now, but if you're new here, then this is new to you. So check out the other shows on KWAZ Radio.
This is DAX. You tune into the Harsh Reality Podcast, providing you with social commentary on the news affecting our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-Black perspective, where Black problems are addressed with Black solutions.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Make sure to also check out the Queen's Council podcast as well. All these likes, cross-promoting, the idea here is to drive more viewers, right, to the other shows on KWAZ Radio. Keep those folks encouraged to keep doing the good job that they've been doing, putting out the information that they've been putting out, or discussing the topics that they discuss. The last episode of the Harsh Reality Podcast was a real good one between D-Web and El Miguel. I always enjoy the Queen's Council, so check out those shows as well. And of course, there's the Pro-Black Perspective, where you get all the information and Pan-African nationalist thinking or thought on that show as well. With that said, let's get into tonight's paper, The Sixth Zone, the African Diaspora and the African Union's Global Era, Pan-Africanism, written by Rita Kiki Edozie. All right. The abstract goes, what lies behind the sustained idea of Pan-African unity, beginning with the early 1900s diaspora Pan-African congresses, through its emergence as state-centric Pan-Africanism in an age of independence, and to its current dispensation as the quote-unquote third stage Pan-Africanism manifest by Africa's African Union. The article examines the manner that the African Union is socio-culturally sculpting and reinventing the universality of the African identity and Pan-African nation. In it, we demonstrate how the African Union is reappropriating the idea of Pan-Africanism among African and African-descended peoples around the world, and using it creatively to mobilize a reconstruction of a global African worldview. This perspective represents the more nuanced, subtle, invisible, though ideational basis through which the AU exerts its political power. and will to reserve its marginalized circumstance and engage geopolitically in a self-determined posture. Here we see the role that culture plays in the AU's global governance objectives. We argue that the AU cultural globalization, rather than essentialist, purist, or racialist, is in effect pluralist, hybrid, transformationalist, and premised on the sustained memory of a global, transgenerational shared set of experiences that have been drawn from as well as reformulated around the idea of Pan-Africanism, but that its prospects for fostering political union and assigning citizen rights to African and African descendant peoples is still an illusion. Right? So again, I talked about this on the show in the past, that honestly, at one point, up until more recently, the term Pan-Africanism on the continent really just referred to those on the continent, right? You could go back and listen to that episode some time ago. And if you want to know which one, listen to all of them, you'll find it, right? But that was a thought that we had in our discussion here on the show, that really and truly, while we're out here talking about Pan-Africanism, right, the continent is thinking about the unity of the countries on the continent, right? And I think, if I'm honest, I think that's one of the biggest mistakes the Pan-Africanists ever made, because that's what allows folks today to say Pan-Africanism has always been a one-way street. Right? Folks have been upset that Haiti was never included in the AU, for example, right? The African Union, right? The idea that I'm trying to get across is that the Pan-Africanists missed a step here and never really reached out properly to those of us outside of the continent. And so let's see how this paper fleshes out that thought. In the introduction, Marcus Garvey, Dr. Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and a host of other black legends all acknowledged that in order for blacks worldwide to change the paradigm of disrespect and exploitation we face daily, Africans in the diaspora and the continent had to find effective ways to reconnect and work towards the unification of the continent into a giant country. That union of African states would have the leverage in international relations to change for the better how Africans see themselves and how Africans are seen. And this general sentiment is shared by most people who are Pan-Africanists in nature or in thought, at least. Right? Onita Say from the Pro-Black Perspective was on the show, was in the chat room recently and talked about build Africa first. And I get it. Most people understand that, ideally that's what we should do, but honestly, some of that thinking might be part of the illusion, right? So most people are going to want to build up what's around them first, right? And again, this is where Pan-Africanists kind of miss a step. You got to reach out to the people and let them know that, we're here, we're thinking about you, there's opportunities in the continent, we can help you where you are for now to get you to the continent, things of that nature. And I think that was kind of missed. The African Union, the current all-African body that is establishing itself to speak for, negotiate for, and work for such African unification, has invited the diaspora to join that process of voting members with 53 continental African countries in order to move as quickly as possible toward that future. We in the diaspora must organize ourselves in an unprecedented way in order to accept that invitation. Absolutely. The extract is cited from a 2007 New York City town hall gathering organized by African Americans in the New York area to respond to the African Union, or the AU's, historic Sixth Zone or Diaspora Clause policy enactment. In 1976, the OAU had divided Africa into 5 zones: West Africa, Central, East, Southern, and North Africa. In 2002, more than 20 years later, The 53 countries that signed the founding African Constitutive Act proclaimed that they were inspired by the noble ideals which guided the founding fathers of our continental organization and generations of Pan-Africanists in their determination to promote unity, solidarity, cohesion, and cooperation among the peoples of Africa and African states. That's HORCA 2002. Again, 4 years on, in 2006, the Constitutive Act expanded its vision to achieve a united African superstate to a sixth zone, which would be located outside of the bounds of continental Africa in the African Diaspora. If, as Valente Mudimbe once proclaimed, that Africa was invented by Western European Enlightenment explorers, in the 21st century, the article currently examines ways that African Union is reinventing the idea of quote-unquote Africa, while constructing the African identity and at least positing it as a shared continental and unified global political entity. Right? It's about time. As reflected in the spirit of the New York City Town Hall Gatherers Communique, the establishment of the AU Diaspora Clause invokes an important academic discussion about the way that the AU is engaged in a particular genre of cultural globalization. In this article, we will see how the AU participates in fostering the universality of the quote-unquote idea of Africa and the notion of a African nation, while tracing by way of illustration and documentation Mamomuchi's claim that the African nation is not based on territoriality, but on African consciousness, premise in a prolonged history and culture of resistance against dehumanizing beliefs, prejudices, and practices. Let me just turn down my phone here. So, let's go to the next page. Culture and globalization play an important role in our methodological framing of the AU's current actions. Walter Anderson has noted that symbols of all kinds have detached themselves from their original roots and float freely like dandelion seeds around the world, according to Pieters 2009. David Held adds that whatever globalization has achieved, it has done so as a result of the significance of the power of culture. Similarly, an emerging school of constructivist international relations scholars argue that it is through an understanding of sociocultural identities, that is, ethnicities, racialisms, nationalisms, religions, regionalisms, and diasporas, the politics ends up where it is. Differently from the political realists, liberals, and structuralists, these postmodern constructivist scholars are more inclined to demonstrate ways that powerful interests are embedded in the social constructions of identities in ways that further subsume these interests to outer cultural claims. In this regard, we employ a transformationalist, agent-centric view of globalization that sees globalization as a complex set of interconnecting relationships through which political power is indirectly exerted culturally. Transformative globalization fosters the transnationalization of cultures and societies in ways that stretch power and politics across frontiers. As such, we would not see the renderings of cultural homogenization and convergence coming from the West to Africa, enshrouded in cultural imperialism, as merely telling the story of globalization regarding Africa. Globalization is a two-way streak in which cultural flows travel from Africa, the so-called periphery, to other parts of the globe in significant ways. Transformationists also acknowledge a cultural element in the definition of globalization that views globalization as a process emerging from a long durée, hybridized melange, where both symmetrical and asymmetrical cultural mixing, and pluralistic and alternative modernities have all structured the evolution of contemporary globalization. The establishment of the historic Sixth Zone Act in 2006. All right, so that tells you how long it took them to do this. Popularly referred to as the Diaspora Clause, we argue, typifies the AU's boldest attempt to illustrate the complex scaffolding involved in the making of cultural globalization in this regard. An important consequence of the AU's Diaspora Clause has been to resuscitate and reappropriate a brand of Pan-Africanism that seeks to develop a common understanding and connection among African nations and African-descended peoples cross-continentally and globally. The current article illustrates the ways in which the AU uses Pan-Africanist ideas, ideology, and identities as basis for its political mobilization. This is a process that is consistent with the AU's self-proclaimed objective to position Africa's global engagement in promoting its own values and a world rich in disparities. The cultural politics method used here helps us to see that the AU's policy acts and decisions are discourse representations. Its political process are formulated through socio-cultural identity mobilizations, and its contemporary political behavior and profile are informed by historical culminations and shared cultural contexts. The AU's construction of meaning about what it is and the diverse domains from which it draws the norms and values that it invokes in Africa's name is integral to the analysis of the African Union's establishment in 2002, and the way that it has operated as a global institution, or I should say as a global institutional actor since then. These issues invoke a range of heuristic questions and underscore the importance of a cultural analysis of globalization in relation to our study of the African Union. How are Africans contributing to the advancement of norms, values, institutions, and mechanisms for action in the contemporary global order? What role has the AU played in constructing meaning, values, interests, and identities of diverse and plural actors in the advancement of its globalist political objectives? What assemblage of cultural traits, practices, and goods have been used to construct meaning symbolically in order to nurture the identity of shared goals among disparate cultures and societies in Africa and its diaspora? Why and how does an AU emerge as a privileged idea and identity in relation to the nationally bounded identity, an Ethiopian or Senegalese, Ghanaian or Nigerian or African American or Jamaican in the 21st century? How do AU Pan-Africanism and Diaspora Pan-Africanism relate to each other in today's global era? And in what ways is the AU's cultural globalization bringing Africans and their descendants closer to political union and citizenship? In the chat room, if you're live with me today, you guys tell me what's been your understanding of the AU? What have you witnessed the AU doing that's been worthwhile to talk about in terms of diasporic Pan-Africanism? In the chat room, I see Kevin K42 says globalism is just another term for colonialism and abuse of Africa's resources. Responding to these questions guides us to reveal a way that the AU utilizes a new hybrid brand of Pan-Africanism to advance a diverse and complex genre of globalization that we argue is primarily cultural. We will see how the AU achieves this feat by redeploying Pan-Africanism and using it as a vehicle for cultivating cultural flows. We argue that Pan-Africanism functions as the AU's marker and symbol that is used to foster greater political recognition and integration among historically, geographically, ethnically, nationally, and linguistic plural and diverse African peoples, both in the continent and what is defined now as the African Diaspora. We contend that the AU's redrawing of the continent into zones, including the establishment of its sixth zone, Diaspora Clause, suggests that through the AU, Pan-Africanism's global unity vision is at least inching toward, if not fully achieving its circular cycle to fruition in the form of global political union and citizenship. In underscoring such revelations about the AU's global impact, subsequent subsections will examine Pan-Africanism's various historical, ideological, institutional, and geographical iterations as these variables relate to the AU's contemporary functions and goals. We then take a closer look at the 6 geographical zones of global Pan-Africa, and we conclude by demonstrating the AU's impact on globalization in this regard as its own fashioning of a continental-led style pluralist global era Pan-Africanism. This brings us to a section called Pan-Africanist Long Durée Globalization, a history from 1906 to 2006, understanding Pan-Africanism. Pan-Africanism is a political and cultural phenomenon which regards Africa, Africans, and African descendants in the African diaspora as a single socio-cultural unit. Now, is that okay? Pan-Africanism seeks to regenerate and unify Africa and promote a feeling of oneness among the people of the African world. Pan-Africanism has a long history in acting as a rallying slogan, a springboard, and an ideological vehicle for cultivating the common efforts of African and African descendant peoples to advance their political efforts globally. Pan-Africanist ideas have shaped the AU's long durée, as well as broad global scope and vision for global African unity. W.E.B. Du Bois viewed the Pan-African movement as aiming at an intellectual understanding and cooperation among all groups of African descent in order to bring about the industrial and spiritual emancipation of the Negro people. African descendant diasporas of Du Bois's genre first forged the idea in response to enslavement, racism, colonialism, and imperialism. These events further facilitated the transcontinental movement against racism and in support for Black liberation and Black nationalism. These ideas continue to inform core elements of the unity vision. In a speech to the Second African Congress in 1963, pioneer Pan-Africanist Kwame Nkrumah predicted this future for African unity when he proclaimed that the third stage of institutionalizing Pan-Africanism would achieve continental consolidation, community and economic, social reconstruction, and transnational unity. In the late 1990s, recently ousted and the late Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi resuscitated Nkrumah's ambition to realize this goal in the United States of Africa, an idea that slowly gained ground among the then 53 African nation states in the form of the African Union. Pan-Africanism has had a long, deep, and broad ideational history, in which differences have manifested according to the varied geographical, ideological, and institutional contexts from which the idea has been thrown up. It was concerned with two elements: oneness of all African people and their descendants, and a commitment to improve their lot. Ron Walters represents the following schema to chart Pan-African relationships. This should be good. A, among African states. B, among African states and African origin states in the diaspora. C, among African states and African origin peoples and communities in the diaspora. D, among African origin states in the diaspora and African origin communities in the diaspora, and E, among African origin communities in the diaspora. On the Walters 1997. Racialistic, continental, non-state, state, institutional, top-down, bottom-up, revolutionary, gradualist, instantist, quote-unquote, cultural, political, transatlantic, and even trans-sub-Saharan are some of the different qualifiers for Pan-Africanism. I remember, I think it was KW7, who was breaking down in the chat room the different genres of Pan-Africanism, and now you could add these to the list as well. There's definitely some instantists out here, right? What am I? I'm more of a, what am I? I guess I ideally would be a revolutionary, but realistically, I think we should probably more so be gradualists, because we got to get people on board. The pioneering diaspora movement, the range of Pan-African ideas. By the way, which one of these are you guys? Are you top-down, bottom-up, revolutionary, gradualist, instantist, cultural, political, transatlantic, and even trans-sub-Saharan? We talked about that sub-Saharan reality a couple weeks ago, right? Which one do you identify with the most? The range of Pan-African ideas have been drawn from these various sources and contexts. Most agree, however, that Pan-Africanist thought begins with diaspora communities in the late 1800s, who, as African descendants that had become citizens in the New World, lived within a racial climate in which they were constantly denigrated because of their African identity. These diasporas responded to the legacy of slavery, racism, and the dissemination of negative stereotypes about Black people with Pan-Africanism. For the diasporas, Pan-Africanism was to be considered in the following terms: Africa as the homeland of Africans and persons of African origins, solidarity among people of African descent, belief in a distinct African personality, rehabilitation of Africa's past, pride in African culture, Africa for Africans in church and state, and a hope for a united and glorious future. Racial identity and the concept of the global African world became an important driving force for this genre of Pan-Africanism. Zizwe Poe recognized it as a formative cultural precept in these early Pan-Africanist ideas. Citing St. Clair Drake, Poe argues that the practice of Pan-Africanism involves participants in an array of local struggles that are part of a larger worldview activity involving Africans and African descendants everywhere, whose various segments have obligations and responsibilities to each other. The first political cultivation of the Pan-Africanist idea began in the late 1800s with the Pan-African Conference of 1906, held in London under the auspices of the activities of pioneer diaspora Pan-Africanists like Henry Sylvester Williams. The idea had been founded by freed Africans like Williams in the diaspora, who began the intellectual and civil societal agitations against slavery, colonialism, and racism towards African people. A Trinidadian lawyer resident in London, Williams himself began his socio-political movement against British colonialism of Trinidad, which he described as a synonym of racial contempt. Williams was also dissatisfied with the conditions of Africans in South Africa, which resulted in the formation of the world's first Pan-African Association, or the PAA, in 1897. PAA's goal was to foster friendly relations between the Caucasian and African races. Is that correct? The Pan-African Association's goal was to foster friendly relations between the Caucasian and African races. Williams went on to become the first African descendant to speak in the House of Commons, and during his one-year residence in Cape Town, South Africa, and became the only black lawyer in the city. He would later organize the Pan-Africanist Congress as an occasion upon which black men and women worldwide would speak for themselves and influence public opinion in their favor. Several other important diaspora personalities founded the inspiration for this movement, which included both men and women. Anna Julia Cooper, for example, was one of only a few African-American female representatives to participate and address the first Pan-African Congress that Williams established. Like Williams, Cooper's brand of black radicalism was international and progressive in incorporating the struggles of both diaspora African Americans in the USA, but of Haitians and of Africans in the continent. Another notable diaspora Pan-Africanist symbol in this struggle was W.E.B. Du Bois. Du Bois was the first African-American man to earn a PhD, and having founded the Paris Congress, he presided over 4 of the 5 pre-independence Congresses from 1919 to 1945. Du Bois' early brand of Pan-Africanism uniquely underscored the global historical importance of Africa. In his book, The World in Africa, Du Bois, 1979, says, quote, "The idea of one Africa to unite the thought and ideals of all native peoples of the Dark Continent belongs to the 20th century and stems naturally from the West Indies and the United States, where various groups of Africans, quite separate in origin, became so united in experience and so exposed to the impact of new cultures that they begin to think of Africa as one idea and one land. It was not, however, until 1900 that a black West Indian barrister called together a conference that would use the word Pan-African for the first time." Du Bois, 1979, page 7. The Chicago Tribune Dispatch would refer to his Paris conference proposal as an Ethiopian utopia, a platform for the Africans guided by an international organization. The second Pan-African Congress that Du Bois helped to organize set the preliminary stages for the African self-determination and unity principles that would inform the African Union's Constitutive Act. In the immediate aftermath of World War I, the Congress demanded from the League of Nations, the Negroes of the world demand that the natives of Africa and the peoples of African descent be governed according to land, capital, labor, education, and state or democracy. The Pan-African Congresses manifest in a series of conferences in 1919, 1923, 1927, and 1945, represented the Pan-African movement of the time. It was already a transatlantic political and cultural mobilization network of African descent. Diasporas and the early African nationalists, the early movement would lay the foundations of the African independence movement after World War II, and transition the style and substance of Pan-Africanism from what St. Drake referred to as racialistic Pan-Africanism to state-centric or institutional Pan-Africanism. The 1945 Manchester Pan-African Congress, whose attendance included Du Bois, Padmore, Kwame Nkrumah, Jomo Kenyatta, and Kamuzu Banda, would provide a platform for this transition. At this conference, the previous meetings, accommodationist policy with colonial rule, would be replaced with the demand for colonial freedom and independence. This brings us to a section called Nkrumah-ism and Pan-African nationalism. In the chat room, I know there's some activity. Kevin Care42 says the AU have to make travel around the continent easier for black people of the world. It would make for better business, wealth, and relocation to the continent. I absolutely agree. Asians have something called ASEAN, or ASEAN, Association of Southeast Asian Nations. Kevin K answers the question I asked, which flavor of Pan-Africanist is he? And he said a gradualist, which I definitely can see. Kevin K 42 goes on to say, you cannot foster friendly relationships with outsiders. History has shown they will eventually stab you in the back. He's referring to the early PAA that wanted to foster good relations with Caucasians and Africans, right? Can't trust them. Nkrumahism and Pan-African nationalism. Ali Mazrui argued that three significant brands of African nationalism could be observed at the 1945 Manchester Congress: an indigenous strand represented by Jomo Kenyatta, the black diaspora strand of Garvey and Du Bois, African for Africans, the socialist communist strands of Senghor, Houphouët Boigny, and Nkrumah. The Manchester Congress triggered the age of Kwame Nkrumah's thought from 1945 to 1965. His speech at the conference would trigger a new direction in the Pan-African movement towards African independence. Nkrumah would assert that the goal of the Congress should be the quote-unquote liquidation of colonialism and imperialism from Africa. The shift was reflected in Nkrumah's speech as he stated, just highlight that, those of us from Africa, more numerous at this assembly than on the earlier ones, had decided that reformism offered at best a delaying strategy. At worst, it could be met just as sharply as outright demand for complete and absolute independence. SBK Asante argues that the Manchester Conference was considered the zenith of the Pan-Africanist movement as it shifted to mass action in Africa rather than in Europe. The struggle would be achieved in the African homelands, with Kwame Nkrumah's friendship and partnership with Trinidadian Pan-Africanist George Padmore. Transatlantic diaspora Pan-Africanism would be integrated with foremost elements of African nationalism as the shift to continental Pan-Africanism, championed by Nkrumah, resulted in Ghana's independence in 1957. Under Nkrumah's leadership, Ghana would become the base for the development and organization of Pan-African thought and activities. The country would convene the first conference of independent African states in April 1958, and with the first All-Africa Pan-African Congress in Accra in December 1958, CLAS would establish a diplomatic framework for the political union of Africa, while the December conferences would provide a haven for African liberation movements in their struggle to end colonialism. Kwame Nkrumah's genre of Pan-Africanism has been referred to as the second phase of Pan-Africanism. This is by Maruthi. Revered as the father of continental Pan-Africanism, Nkrumah would nonetheless incorporate diaspora, racialists, and transatlantic Pan-Africanism into his political thought. Nkrumah noted that all peoples of African descent were African and belonged to the African nation. The ideology of Nkrumahism was used as a vehicle to synthesize a range of Pan-African ideals, including revolutionary, racialistic, integrationist, and continental. Nkrumah's Pan-Africanism will begin the journey of institutionalizing Pan-Africanism as Nkrumah's aggressively began its promotion among independent African nations during the era of decolonization. Pan-African nationalism would foster the second stage of Black Africanism in the 1963 establishment of the OAU in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. The second stage of Pan-Africanism represented many shifts in the ideational assumptions and premises of the Pan-Africanist movement. This genre of Pan-Africanism would be dominated by the continental, state-centric, as well as gradualist strains. The earlier racialist brand of Pan-Africanism, advanced by Williams and Du Bois, would be displaced in international significance by the new constitutional and institutional manifestation of Pan-Africanism, though racialist transatlantic Pan-Africanism continued as a non-state culturalist movement in the diaspora, especially in the USA. The newer cultural premises of continental Pan-Africanism, spearheaded by Nkrumah, are best understood by the diverse ideas imbibed by three factions of African nationalism, whose compromised pact would ultimately found the OAU. These groups were Nkrumah's Casablanca group, the Brazzaville group, and the Monrovia group. The 1960 Congo crisis, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, DRC, sparked the intellectual formations of these groups. Whether the meeting in Morocco, attended by Ghana, Guinea, Mali, and Egypt, was spearheaded by Nkrumah to salvage what would be his almost two-decade ideological aspirations for a united African states, against the earlier formation of the moderate Brazzaville group, or whether the meeting was simply a call for the few independent African progressive states to debate the Congo as a case by which African union had to be achieved, is not important. The fact is that the Casablanca meeting underscored the ideological parameters of Nkrumah's brand of Pan-Africanism: continental, pan-integrationist, revolutionary, and socialist. Pan-integrationists. Okay. Hold on one second. Dominated by Nkrumah and Egyptian national leader Abdel Nasser, the Casablanca meeting developed the Casablanca Charter, which would enshrine Nkrumah's United States of Africa vision within a socialist agenda. The Casablanca Charter called for the establishment of a number of committees which would underscore some of the institutional elements of today's AU. These included the African Political Committee, the African Economic Committee, the African Cultural Committee, the African Consultative Committee, and the Joint African High Command. The less progressive Francophone African countries, including Congo, Brazzaville, Cote d'Ivoire, Cote d'Ivoire, held a meeting with Ethiopia, Nigeria, Sierra Leone, and Liberia around a more moderate African response to the Congo crisis and a rejection of socialism would forge the Brazzaville group. An extended version of Brazzaville, including the attendance of 20 African nations at a meeting in Liberia and consequently in Lagos, Nigeria, would constitute the Monrovia group. This brand of Pan-Africanism would stand for a more gradualist posture toward African unity and would not alienate the West from the future economic development of the continent. Well, that's nonsense at the end. Ethiopia's Haile Selassie characterized the ideological Pan-Africanist visions at the Lagos Second Monrovia Group Conference. Quote, "We are told that Africa has been split into competing groups and that this is inhibiting cooperation among the African states and severely retarding African progress. One hears of the Casablanca Group and the Monrovia Group, of the Conakry and Dakar declarations, and we are warned that the views and policies of these so-called groups are so antithetical as to make it impossible for them to work together as partners in an enterprise to which all are mutually devoted. But do such hard and fast groupings really exist? And if certain nations sharing similar views have taken measures to coordinate their policies, does this mean that as between these nations and others, there's no possibility of free and mutual cooperation? Ethiopia considers herself a member of one group only, the African group. When we Africans have been misled into pigeonholing one another into attributing rigid and inflexible views to states which were present at one conference but not at the other, then we shall, without reason or justification, have limited our freedom of action and rendered immeasurably more difficult the task of joining our efforts in harmony and brotherhood in the common cause of Africa. No wide and unbridgeable gulf exists between the various groups which have been created. We urge that his conference use this as a starting point. That we emphasize and lay stress on the areas of similarity and agreement rather than upon whatever disagreements and differences may exist among us. This brings us to a section called State-Centric Pan-Africanism in the OAU. In the comments, in the chat, Kevin Care 42 says like, share, comment, and subscribe. I agree. It goes on to say, why should they feel bad about alienating the West? The West and now the East is screwing Africa. The hell with them. Yeah, that makes it seem like the gradualists, and this is not my idea of gradualists, by the way. But that makes it seem like the gradualists were also some form or some type of integrationist too. And I'm not for the integration part of anything. Right? I don't know why I feel sleepy all of a sudden. State-centric Pan-Africanism and the OAU. In 1963, at an African Heads of State and Government meeting in Addis Ababa, Selassie's speech would foster the reconciliation of the two visions for African unity. 30 of the 32 independent African nations were represented and presented 4 distinct charters for African unity, including Nkrumah's call for instantaneous unity and integration. Sekou Touré called for a reconciled Casablanca and Monrovia charter under United Africa, and Senegal's gradual economic integration. Touré insisted that the Addis Ababa conference not close until a charter had been developed. Selassie's wish came true, hence a compromise charter established the OAU. Knowing Nkrumah's scholars and followers viewed the OA Charter Compromise as a mere continental association where the African unity would be promoted, the sovereign equality of all member states would be upheld, and the principle of non-interference would be maintained. This charter was a far cry from the vision for Pan-Africanism that had begun with Williams, Du Bois, and Nkrumah. Nonetheless, with its objectives to promote the unity and solidarity of African states, to defend their sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence, and to eradicate all forms of colonialism, and finally to promote human rights, the OAU will again represent yet another transition and iteration of the Pan-Africanist movement. Adejumobi and Olukoshi will refer to the OAU as a status intergovernmental organization with an overarching mandate for liberation of the continent. Bring me to another section called the African Union's third stage, Pan-Africanism. Despite its reputation as a quote-unquote dictators club, the OAU accomplished its foremost goals. Adejumobi and Olukoshi rightly claimed that the OAU's 40-year legacy cultivated among member councils shared norms and principles regarding African unity. Yet by 2002, with the post-apartheid transition of South Africa, 22 newly independent states had joined the union, thereby completing for the OAU the elimination of colonialism in the continent and at least the realization of another member state. Unity in the millennium, despite South African decolonization and the end of proxy Cold Wars fought on African soil, new challenges exposed Africa's economic underdevelopment as parts of the continent were afflicted with the HIV/AIDS and new brutal conflicts in Sierra Leone, Liberia, Rwanda, the DRC, Burundi, Somalia, and the Sudan, to name a few. The OAU needed a new ideational boost, an energizer that would accelerate Pan-African integration to make faster progress in advancing Africa's self-determined development vision. The 2002 formation of the AU out of the OAU represented the third institutionalization of Pan-Africanism. Two continental leaders, the former president of South Africa, Thabo Mbeki, and ousted and late leader of Libya, Muammar Gaddafi, personified the Pan-Africanism that drove the emergence of the African Union. Each reappropriated the idea of Pan-Africanism in different ways. Mbeki would invoke the idea of Renaissance, an idea that Mamo Muchi says complements rather than substitutes Pan-Africanism. On the other hand, promoting a form of neo-Pan-Africanism, Libya's Muammar Gaddafi promoted Arab-African relations around a geographical consideration of African unity that would represent an African bloc to compete with other world blocs. Pan-Africanism that gave birth to the AU would contend, complement, as well as reconcile these two ideological strains within a new context of Africa and globalization. You see, this is where guys like Dr. John Henry Clark and stuff will call Gaddafi an opportunist, right? Because really what he was trying to do was establish a stronger relationship between the Arab world and the African world. While taking on a controversial role at the 1999 OAU summit in Sirte, Libya, Libya's Muammar Gaddafi reintroduced an Nkrumah model of African integration and resuscitated notions of the racial unity of Africa. South Africa's Renaissance philosophy, combined with Gaddafi's resuscitation of Nkrumah's Casablanca Charter, once again mobilized Africans to forge greater unity and integration to combat these challenges. In doing so, Gaddafi reignited another strain of Pan-Africanism, which is trans-Saharan Pan-Africanism. At the 1999 OAU summit in Sirte, Libya, Gaddafi offered the recitation of Nkrumah's vision as an alternative to the continent's possible disintegration as a result of its challenges. Gaddafi would proclaim, "We do not deny that we are Arabs, but politically and geographically we are Africans for thousands of years until the last migration. Our forefathers emigrated over land. That is why they are called the Berber." So put that to rest, that the Berbers were some black folks, right? Berbers were some Arabs. In 2001, presenting the more moderate version of African Unity's replica of Nigeria's 1960s opposition to Nkrumah's Casablanca integration model, Nigeria's Olusegun Obasanjo ratified the formation of an AU that would embody a version of African solutions for African problems. In 2002 in Durham, South Africa, the AU was officially launched, and South Africa's president, Thabo Mbeki, became its first president. The elimination of apartheid in South Africa instigated the Renaissance philosophy of Pan-Africanism as yet another cultural drift and integration that would advance cultural globalization in Africa. Mbeki's invocation of an African Renaissance fit comfortably with the sustained Renaissance pulses that dominate the Pan-Africanist movement. Pan-African Renaissance would string together the philosophical strains of a country that had only recently been freed from centuries of racial oppression and colonialism, and that only recently been freed from centuries of racial oppression and colonial, and a Pan-Africanist vision for a unified and developed Africa. The African Union's 2006 enactment of the Diaspora Clause, 6 representing yet another expansion of Pan-Africanism. The clause has reignited transatlantic Pan-Africanism while perhaps serving to reunite it with a continental Pan-Africanism. What is more, the AU's institutional and state-centric brand of Pan-Africanism is recultivating global relations with non-state cultural Pan-Africanist forces, including an array of African heritage peoples and governments, African civil societal groups, African American civil rights social movements, Pan-African identity activists, and movements in the Caribbean, Central and South America. In doing so, the African nation's Pan-Africanism seeks to reconstruct shared symbolic meanings amongst Africans and African descendants in ways that broach a renewed common understanding among and between people and nations of the Black world. The diaspora called for the AU represents the way that Pan-Africanism has served as a cultural code that has facilitated circular, transmillennial, and universal movements of African people throughout the world. It is this dynamic history of Pan-Africanism shared by Africans and African-descended peoples that provides the context by which a pan-nationalist consciousness has evolved into the 21st century usage by the African Union. Bring us to a section of the paper called The United States of Pan-Africa, the multinational African continent. Let me take a quick station break here, take a sip of water and whatnot, and I'll be back on the other side.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
This is DAX. You tune into the Harsh Reality Podcast, providing you with social commentary on the news affecting our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-Black perspective, where Black problems are addressed with Black solutions.
Make sure you guys check out those shows as well as the Queen's Council on KWAZ Radio. So we're back at this paper and we're reading, we've read through some of the history of Pan-Africanism just now. We're looking at this part of the paper called the United States of Pan-Africa, mapping a diverse and plural continent, zones 1 through 5, the multinational African continent. All right. If you're here listening live with me on a Thursday night, I appreciate you. Thanks for coming through. I see some of the regulars. Kevin Care 42 has been here. Active Black Excellence has been in the room. I haven't seen some other regulars, but I'm sure you're out there somewhere, and I appreciate you all the same. Mama Muchi argues that the next stage of Pan-Africanism is the construction of the African nation and the African citizen. This will be Du Bois's vision of Pan-Africa. Rather than the 55 independent territorial countries that make up the continent today, the ideal of an African nation would be defined by the consciousness that has been cultivated by Pan-African predecessors, and that is based on the continent's and people's history and culture of resistance against dehumanizing beliefs, prejudices, and practices. It would represent, according to Muchi, the logo of that consciousness and the living resistance that has defined Pan-Africanism since 1906. We see from the history of Pan-Africanism that the idea is also deeply contested from ideational, ideological, identity, and organizational platforms. Pan-Africanism contains complex and diverse characteristics as an institution that seeks to cross, as well as transcend, a multiplicity of identity borders locally, nationally, regionally, and globally. Pan-Africa's pluralism has been a bedrock, as well as a challenge for African unity. In December 1958, at the All-African People's Conference convened in Accra, Ghana, W.E.B. Du Bois's wife delivered an address on behalf of the then 91-year-old Pan-Africanist veteran entitled, quote, "The Future of Africa," end quote. Du Bois stated, "If Africa unites, it will be because each part, each nation, each tribe gives up a part of the heritage for the good of the whole." That is what union means. That is what Pan-Africa means. The union's diversity challenges have been established in different iterations of African leadership. Akokpuri, Ndinga Muvumbu, and Marithi in 2008 have suggested that when the union was established in 2002, 4 generations of activist African leaders had emerged. 1, the Pan-Africanist generation. 2, the Nationalist generation. 3, the Globalist generation. And 4, the Renascent or New Pan-Africanist generation. Pan-Africanist leaders predominated the first stage of Pan-Africanism up to 1945, from Williams to Du Bois, while the nationalist leaders who focus on nation building and national identity in their respective nation states dominated the second stage, state-centric Pan-Africanism of the OAU era. Third group of leaders is the Globalist generation, usually consisting of opposition leaders who favor global identity claims of democracy, pluralism, human rights, and a liberalized market system. However, the new Pan-Africanists, who are also of the global area, privilege Africans' self-determined efforts to transform the continent's own social, economic, and political conditions. By its 1963 establishment, the 31 founding OAU states had already demonstrated the perils of diversity, factionalism, stalemate, compromise that had the potential to foster disunity and breakdown. Nkrumah recognized his challenge when he pleaded with his colleagues in the 1960s in a speech that was reminiscent of Du Bois's 1958 call for Pan-Africa. Our freedom stands open to danger just as long as the independent states of Africa remain apart. It is for us to surmount the separatist tendencies in sovereign nationhood by coming together speedily into a union of African states. Territorial boundaries are the relics of colonialism that divide us. While the gradualists of the Monrovia group won the day, and not Nkrumah, in laying the foundation of African unity in the post-colonial era, Nkrumah's ideals and Pan-Africanist visions continue to underlie Africa's post-colonial quote-unquote unity endeavor. The foremost challenge for the early OAU was not to ground African nationalism and racial Pan-Africanism in the new context of a post-colonial independent Africa consisting of sovereign territorial nation states shrouded further in ethnic, linguistic, ideological, and national differences. How would the experience of Africa be universalized in such a context? How would unity be established in such diversity? The gradualistic movement of the Monrovia group will adopt a state-centric approach based on absolute equality of sovereign national African states. The right that each state would not be involuntarily annexed to another state, but rather there will be voluntary union of one state with another. Nevertheless, the OAU also adopted a liberal cooperation framework whereby the organization would support solidarity among states. Regular and consistent cooperation among member states will cultivate shared norms and multilateral decision-making, and action among Africans in ways that would foster an organic consciousness among Africans. So you reach this session called Zoning the Continent. The OAU would now begin to embark upon the recognition of the vast continental diversity of the continent by zoning. 13 years after its founding at the 26th Ordinary Session held in Addis Ababa, the year 1976, the organization divided the continent into 5 regional zones. The resolution established the 5 zones on the premise that there would be an equitable geographical distribution of representation on a regional basis of all OAU member states in the UN, at the UN specialized agencies, other international organizations, and within OAU institutions. Zoning will become a first step in constituting a diverse yet democratically inclusive, federated, multi-regional continental union. The 5 regions were namely Northern, Western, Central, Eastern, and Southern. Turn this fan on for a second. The deep and broad scope of diversity of Africa is reflected in the 5 zones. Linguistic diversity, for example, which is reflected in Africa's pre-colonial ethnic and subnational cultural diversity, is merely one level in illustrating the continent's pluralism. While the current African Union has adopted 3 languages for its official operations, look at this. English, French, and Arabic. As many as 2,000 languages are spoken in the continent. As well, the continent's national identities are primarily manifest through a former colonial structure, including English, French, Portuguese, Spanish, and Northern Africa's Arabic, Ethiopia's Amharic, and Tanzania's Swahili, being the only official indigenous national lingua franca cultures represented. The continent is religiously diverse, with most countries containing within them sizable majority, minority affiliations to African religions, Islam, and Christianity. Africa's 5 regions are microcosms of the diversity that is representative of the whole continent. Like the whole continent, it is difficult to find regional, cultural, universality. Shared identity is based on historical experiences by peoples and communities who have traversed and resided in common territorial and spatial neighborhoods. Regional economic communities such as the Economic Community of West African States, or KWAZ, Southern African Development Councils, SADC, Eastern African Community, EAC, Francophone West and Central African Monetary Union, CFA, Maghreb Union, Economic Community of West African States, ECCAS, Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa, COMESA, have also fostered regional cultures and contexts for shared identities. Political cultures vary from region to region as well. Observing the process of African unification as early as 1962, Erasmus Cloman Jr. observed that the Casablanca, Brazzaville, and Monrovia groupings grew out of a combination of both ideological and regional factors. While still exhibiting their early nationalist cultural legacies, Africa's 1976 regional zones differ according to several variables, including decolonization experience and independence wave, first, second, or third, charismatic leadership, and national country prominence in pan-regional and global contexts. Brings us to a section about West Africa. West Africa is one of the most vibrant regions, as well as the most formidable designers and contributors to the Pan-Africanist forces that underlay today's African Union. The region's tragic and historic location for the European transatlantic slave trade of Africans to the New World, Liberia and Sierra Leone, its location for the Back to Africa and returnee movements from the USA, Brazil, and the Caribbean, and Nkrumah's Ghana, most West African countries' first wave independence, 1957 to 1961, Francophone African negritude, and the revolutionary socialism of Senegal and Guinea, and Nigeria's economic, political, and cultural hegemonic status as a giant of Africa inform the contributing factors that make it a foremost region. We have already seen how, as quasi-independent colony purchased by the American Colonization Society Liberia, and West Africa became an early hub for the Pan-Africanist activities of W.E.B. Du Bois, as well as Marcus Garvey's Back to Africa movements in the 1920s. In 1923, Du Bois was appointed by the U.S. State Department to represent the U.S. government in the inauguration of Charles King to a second term in office to preside as president of Libya. Du Bois used the occasion to promote Liberia, albeit a pro-American Liberian, as an important intellectual reservoir for the Pan-Africanist ideas of the likes of Edward Blyden. In another West African country, Ghana, there's little doubt that the charismatic personality of a single individual, Kwame Nkrumah, has made the difference in fostering the country and region's political culture. In 1957, Nkrumah remarked that the independence of Ghana would be meaningless unless it was linked with the total liberation of Africa. Nkrumah inspired the ideological posture of the Casablanca Group. And by creating the Bureau of African Affairs, Accra, Ghana became the focal point of activity in support of African liberation struggles, for the likes of whom would become Africa's greatest nationalist leaders: Nkomo, Roberto, Neto, Monlane, and Obodi, Toure, and Kita. Throughout the hold on one second. Sorry about that. Yeah. So Ghana became the focal point of activity in support of African liberation struggles, for the likes of whom would become Africa's greatest nationalist leaders in Como, Roberto, Neto, Mon Lane, Obode, Toure, and Keita. Throughout the 1930s through the 1970s, the charismatic personality and Pan-Africanist leadership of Leopold Senghor would place Senegal at the helm of the mobilization of cultural Pan-Africanism. Senghor's negritudious ideas encountered and complemented the political Pan-Africanism fostered by Du Bois in the 1930s. While a socialist like Nkrumah-ism, nonetheless, Senghor's deep affiliation with Francophone Africa and his allegiance to a transnational cultural nationalism whose borders span Dakar, Paris, and Harlem would land Senegal. Hold on a second. Among Brazzaville and ultimately the Monrovia Pan-Africanist groupings. Guinea and Mali under Sekou Toure and Mobida Keita, Francophone, which were West African nations affiliated with the Nkrumahist Pan-Africanist philosophies, but also symbolize the ideological and cultural vibrancy of this region. Guinea, especially with Ghana in 1958, announced to the world that their two countries would constitute themselves as the nucleus of a union of West African states that had been inspired by the 13 American colonies. The only Francophone African country to organize Guineans into a successful non-vote in a referendum that would choose to remain part of the French colonial empire. Toure claimed that his decision had blazed a trail for African independence and solidarity that would realize the United States of Africa. West Africa's regional diversity would not be complete without the role that Nigeria has played both in ideological and cultural Pan-Africanist formation. In the formation of the OAU, the country's tripartite nationalist movement, that's the Hausa, Yoruba, and Igbo, culminated in a moderate functionalist Pan-Africanism, alleging to the Monrovia group, whose Charter for African Unity would ultimately be ratified in Lagos, Nigeria, at the group's second meeting. Nigeria's prime minister at the time, Tafawa Balewa, emerged as a dominating personality. Balewa's moderation is claimed to have contributed to the gradualist, functionalist approach that underlines the African Union Pan-Africanist principles today. Nigeria's middle-of-the-road moderate Pan-Africanism remain a consistent philosophy that the country uses to facilitate the culture of West Africa. The country's hegemonic stature fostered its prominent role in founding ECOWAS and hosting the OAU's Lagos Plan of Action, the African Economic Community and New Partnership for African Development, in promoting the quote-unquote African calabash approach to conflict resolution under its leader and former OAU chairman, Olusegun Obasanjo, and then finally, once again, recommending a gradualist, functionalist AU in 2000 over Libya's quest for an Nkrumah's AU vision. And while East Africa records less of an active role in first and second stage Pan-Africanism, Ethiopia nonetheless hosts the headquarters of the continental Pan-Africanist unions under the OAU and its successor organization, the AU, consisting of the Horn of Africa countries and the former East African Community. The region is diverse in both pre-colonial and colonial histories and cultures. Nonetheless, two countries in the region, Ethiopia and Tanzania, are distinctive in their representation of the only African countries whose national cultures are indigenously African are not reflective of a former colonial power. As a result, both countries represent for the East African region an important contribution to the idea of the universal African. Mazrui has noted that the Ethiopians' spirited and determined resistance to Italian invasions like the Battle of Ottawa, 1896, and the Ethiopian War of 1935 to 1936 inspired anti-colonial Pan-Africanism all over the world. Most agree that Emperor Haile Selassie's Pan-Africanism evolved from a conservative feudal king of Ethiopia who referenced the country's roots in the Middle East instead of in the cultures of East Africa. And I think that's why a lot of folks don't like His Majesty. Selassie would eventually become stalwart Pan-Africanist who used his symbol of radical and revolutionary Pan-Africanism abroad to broker the establishment of the Organization of African Unity in 1963. Selassie would implore his nationalist colleagues when he proclaimed, quote, "This conference cannot close without adopting a single African charter. We cannot leave here without having created a single African organization. If we fail in this, we will have shirked our responsibility to Africa and to the peoples we lead. If we succeed, then and only then, we will have justified our presence here." For you guys who are here live with me, if you're still here live with me, I don't know if I still got people listening. If you're live with me, what are your thoughts on Emperor Haile Selassie the First? In the chat room, I see KW Don has made an appearance. Always appreciate KW Don 7. He says the gradual approach is taking too long to get done. I agree with that. And I think that's because the gradual approach should not have been the first approach. Or should not have been the early approach, right? I think the instantation, what's the word? The more instant approach would have been better, especially in the time when you talk about when the Pan-African conferences were occurring, right? That was a time where you had black folks in America not too long out of being enslaved. And at that time, I mean, of course, you had those folks who would have been too afraid to leave America, claiming that they didn't know Africa. But at that time, I think, especially when Garvey was around just a little bit later on, in that period of time, I think was black folks' was African people's best time to move. I'm talking about outside and within the continent. Because you see what Garvey's influence was on the continent, right? A lot of those early first presidents and prime ministers or what have you of those African countries that gained independence, presidents really, where a lot of those guys were influenced by Garvey directly or by some student of Garvey, right? So I agree with you that now the gradualist approach now is a frustrating approach. It's taking too long, and I think it's taking too long because of when the approach was taken. It was taken too early. But at the same time, because we missed our time, this is why striking while the iron is hot is so important. Because we kind of missed that time, in my humble opinion. People have become settled. People have become settled into these regions where they are. Now it's harder to just tell them to give it up or to focus on focus on elsewhere. Kevin K42 says His Imperial Majesty was the best. He was a true leader who never gave up against the spaghetti eaters. KW Dawn 7 says Selassie was not the conquering lion of Judah. He was the running lion of Judah. My Rastafarian friends will take exception to that statement, but it's true. KW Dawn, I know exactly what you're talking about, where you're coming from, but others might not know. If you want to expand on that a little bit in the chat, that'll be helpful for those who come along this episode later, and I'll read your thoughts. I know what it's about, but I've heard some people say that His Majesty was a race trader. What do you guys' thought on the claim that His Majesty was a race trader? Ethiopianism thus developed as both a form of early Pan-Africanism associated sometimes with the emergence of independent African churches, which would follow in the tradition of Ethiopia's 2,000-year history of African independent Christianity, as well as a global political Pan-Africanist movement worldwide, symbolizing Black resistance to Western imperialism, which is what Kevin K42 is talking about. Ethiopia's historic capital city, Addis Ababa, became a benefiting headquarters for institutional and state-centric Pan-Africanism in the OAU and the AU. Issa Shivji has noted the divergent symbols of Ghana's Nkrumah brand of Pan-Africanism compared to that practiced by Tanzania's Julius Nyerere. He writes that Teacher Nyerere was an ardent and militant African nationalist and an equally convinced and persuasive Pan-Africanist. However, he claims that differently, Nyerere saw a tension between nationalism and Pan-Africanism. While Nyerere understood the role that anti-colonialism played in inventing and thus universalizing an African identity, the nationalist known as Teacher was best renowned for his successful nurturing of an African-style sovereign territorial nationalism in the name of Ujamaa, meaning the African family. C.L.R. James would say that Nyerere's greatest accomplishment was in laying the basis of an African state, while the Arusha Declaration, in which Nyerere laid down his principles, is one of the great documents of post-World War II. C.L.R. James. In 1974, Julius Nyerere's African national identity would attract the venue for the 6th Pan-African Congress, almost 30 years after the 5th PAC held in Manchester, UK. C.L.R. James, a Trinidadian Pan-Africanist scholar, had requested Tanzania as the venue because of the country's model of self-reliance. So that brings us to part of the paper that is about North Africa. Africans have legitimately been reluctant to adhere to the normative sub-Saharan Africa, North Africa, Middle East divide. North Africa, Middle East divide. This is particularly true because of both regions' shared experience with nationalism and Pan-Africanism. Mazrui notes a significant strain of Pan-Africanism, Trans-Saharan Pan-Africanism, which represents the solidarity of the peoples of Northern and Sub-Saharan Africa. Egypt's own revolutionary nationalist, Gamal Abdel Nasser, is credited to have begun the process of re-Africanizing Egypt in ways that recultivated historic Arab-African solidarity on the continent. What do you guys thought on Gamal Nasser? I've always had mixed feelings about that guy. NASA worked with many African leaders, including Nkrumah, despite their later competitive rift, to stand up against imperialism, committing Egypt to support African liberation movements. NASA would write, "We cannot in any way stand aside, even if we wish to, from the sanguinary and dreadful struggle now raging in the heart of the continent between 5 million whites and 200 million Africans. We cannot do so for one principal and clear reason. We ourselves are in Africa." Morocco and Algeria, also Maghreb countries, played pioneering Pan-Africanist roles during the second phase. The Casablanca group gets its name from the North African country, Morocco, whose King Farouk called for and hosted the historic meeting in his country. Algeria's Ben Bella also played an influential role in fostering Pan-African unity. During the third phase of Pan-Africanism, the formation of the AU, it is North Africa's Libya that would launch a rekindling of trans-Saharan Pan-Africanism. We have seen already how ousted and late leader Muammar Gaddafi's 1999 Sirte Declaration called for Africa's resuscitation of Nkrumah's United States of Africa vision, which in principle launches the African Union in 2002. Apparently, Gaddafi turned back to Africa in the 1990s during Libya's period of isolation from the West. Right? Dr. John Henry Clark is to talk about that. Gaddafi maintained that Africa existed as a geographical entity, which historically included Arabs. Yet North and Sub-Saharan Africans alike have been cautious of the Islamist motivations behind Gaddafi's Pan-Africanist intentions. Additionally, they had always been concerned by some members as to whether Gaddafi's brand of Pan-Africanism was a reactionary anti-Western rant that could serve to foster hostile Africa-West relations. Needless to say, nevertheless, no North African leader would foster greater integration between North Africa and the rest of the continent. What do you guys feel about Gaddafi now? So I talked about His Majesty. What do you guys feel about Gaddafi? What do you guys feel about Nasser from Egypt? This brings us to the section of the paper about Central Africa. Before I do that, let me read what's going on in the chat room. KW Don 7 says, "I would be inclined to believe that Menelik II was a conquering lion. Selassie practiced colorism in Ethiopia by mistreating the Oromo people in the south. Selassie didn't run the Italians out of Ethiopia. He had to beg the West, specifically Great Britain, for military assistance. Everyone has to be reversed engineered." Kevin Care42 says, "As you said earlier, Arabs are just opportunists." Arabs are just opportunists. So that covers Nasser and Gaddafi. All right. Again, I want to thank you guys, particularly Kevin Care42 and KW Don 7 for being here with me tonight, participating in this podcast episode. It would be a dry episode without you guys in the chat room, so let's keep it going. Central Africa. Hosting the Brazzaville in the Congo-Brazzaville Pan-Africanist group and the home country Gabon of the illustrious AU Commission Chairman Jean Ping, Central Africa, a region of mostly Francophone small African states, has received little attention as a region of Africa. Underrepresentation of the region was one reason why, in 2011, President Obiang Nguema of Equatorial Guinea was elected AU president despite his controversial democratic leadership credentials. Africa's largest and richest in mineral resources nation though most troubling nation, the DRC is part of this region. The home of Patrice Lumumba, the DRC has historically existed in Africa's Pan-Africanist imagination. But by the way, I'm pretty sure I posted this on the Discord under Conscious Videos. I think I did. Speaking of the Discord, I should grab the link. There was this documentary, man, talking about Lumumba's last days, and I've read about it and I've seen other documentaries concerning it about his last days, or his last day, I should say, or 2 days. And yeah, I did post it in the Discord. Have you guys checked it out? I mean, one of the most heart-wrenching views I've ever had. Because these Europeans are talking about the mistreatment and murder of Lumumba so nonchalantly, right? A lot of these are French dudes too, right? Dudes from Belgium and stuff like that too. And it's like, when people talk about savages, I want black folks, African people, to get that out their mind, that they're any kind of savage. And to understand that if you see any kind of savage behavior from our people, there's a European behind it. I mean, just a tough watch. And they're, at the time, these dudes are old dudes. These dudes are old dudes, and so like, you would think there'd be some remorse. There was none. KW-7s, a lot of Ethiopians have mixed ancestry. Some of them don't identify as African. Selassie comes from that stock. Yeah, there's truth to that. I mean, a lot of those guys consider themselves Arabs, and like I've referenced it a few times in the last few months on this show. There's a video of an Ethiopian guy like on a panel, and he's talking about, just because we're dark skinned don't mean we identify with the blacks. We're dark skinned because of how close we are to the sun, but we don't really identify with the blacks. Their problem is not our problem. And I've never forgotten it either, right? I've never forgotten ever seeing that either. And that guy, was it KW-7 who told me? Someone told me that guy is still alive, actually, still alive and kicking. Some kind of diplomat, like an ambassador or something for Ethiopia, still to this day. And this is old footage, like from like the 60s or something like that, mid-60s, right? You gotta keep you have to keep those things in mind. The Congo-Brazzaville Pan-Africanist grouping will be the first to convene to deliberate on critical issues regarding the sovereignty and security of Africa in light of the DRC Congo crisis in 1960. The Brazzaville meeting debated whether or not to invite UN and African troops into the Congo, and its moderate conclusions to support international intervention through the formation of the Casablanca Group, which spurred the security principle behind the African Union. That Africa will police itself. Brings us to the section on Southern Africa. Aside from Nyasaland, Malawi, Zambia, Northern Rhodesia, and Botswana, much of Southern Africa was still under colonialism during the early stages of the second phase of Pan-Africanism that would establish the OAU in 1963. Dr. Hastings Banda, Malawi's charismatic nationalist leader, however, had amended the 1945 Fifth Pan-Africanist Congress in Manchester, notwithstanding Portuguese colonialism in Angola and Mozambique, and apartheid settler colonization in South Africa, Old Southern Rhodesia or Zimbabwe, and the Old Southwest Africa, Namibia. Pan-Africanism would target Africa's southernmost region for its raison d'etre. Targeting this region was tantamount to the goals of African unity. It will require another 3-decade struggle to remove the last bastions or bastards of colonialism from the continent. There is no wonder that this region hosts some of Pan-Africa's most charismatic and celebrated liberation leaders. Mondlane, Machel, Neto, Mugabe, controversially, and a host of South African nationalists ranging from Sobukwe, Sisulu, Mandela to Mbeki. I like Mbeki, actually. The 1994 historic dismantling of apartheid in South Africa marked a historic turn in the Pan-Africanist movement, representing the Southern African region and the continent of South Africa. And the continent. South Africa would take on the new Pan-Africanist leadership. What some suggest was a rescuing of the Pan-Africanist vision away from Gaddafi, away from Gaddafi's ultra-radical vision. South Africa's Thabo Mbeki would rationalize change to the AU in the following way. The OAU engaged in 4 decades of struggle, aiming to realize the goal of the continent's modern-day founding fathers. OAU lived up to its mandate to eradicate all forms of colonialism from Africa. In his quote-unquote "I am African" speech, Mbeki would exhibit both the diversity and solidarity of struggle that embodies Southern Africa's and now continues to embody continental Africa's struggle for the African personality. In May 1996, as deputy president, Mbeki proclaimed that it felt good to be an African in a post-apartheid Africa, saying, "I am born of the peoples of the continent of Africa. The pain of the violent conflict of the peoples of Liberia, Somalia, the Sudan, Burundi, and Algeria is a pain I also bear. The dismal shame of poverty, suffering, human degradation of my continent, it's a blight that we share. The blight on our happiness that derives from this and from our drift to the periphery of the ordering of human affairs leaves us in a persistent shadow of despair. This is a savage road for which nobody should be condemned. This thing that we have done today in this small corner of a great continent that has contributed so decisively to the evolution of humanity says that Africa reaffirms that she is continuing her rise from the ashes. Whatever the difficulties, Africa shall be at peace. However improbable it may sound to skeptics, Africa will prosper." You got it like that. The last region to fully decolonize, led by Africa's most industrious economy and multiracial culture, South Africa and SADC may indeed spearhead the Pan-Africanism required to cultivate the quote-unquote African universal identity that the AU's first president, Thabo Mbeki, refers to. You guys who are with me listening live or even listen to the playback, you can leave this comment. What do you guys see as the universal, as the African universal identity? How would you guys formulate the words to describe the African universal identity? In the chat room, KW Don 7 says Lumumba was marked for death after his inauguration speech, in which he said that the resources in Africa should benefit Africans. You sound like you're quoting one of those old white dudes from the documentary. So that's what one of them plainly said. He said after Lumumba made that speech, he was a dead man. KW Don 7 says Mandela was never a nationalist. He was always an integrationist. Was he always an integrationist, or did he come out of prison an integrationist? Mandela endorses a Urugu transvestite homophile and told African children, "You be like him." That I cannot forgive. I must have forgotten. Who's this transvestite homophile? I must have forgotten that part. I think I've said this on the show before, but some people might believe me, but I actually met Mandela soon after he got out of captivity. He was doing like this tour where he was going to different countries, and he came to mine, and he came to the college, and I was a freshman college student when Mandela came, and I went to go see his speech. I'm sure I talked about this on the show before. I went to see him talk, and I happened to stand by like a side door, and lo and behold, Mandela and the Prime Minister comes through the side door, and I shake his hand. So I always have respect for him, but I know that the Mandela that we knew in our lifetime as a free man, who died some years ago now, I know that he wasn't a man with the same fervor that he had before he went into prison. Global Pan-Africa's 6th zone. So we're finally getting to the 6th zone, which is wild, but at the same time, it's kind of good to get that little bit of history in there, right? So reconciling the contested terrain of the African diaspora. If continental diversity were not enough to contend with through the African Union's diaspora clause, Africans have expanded their domains of pluralism to the globe. The mere act that declared the enactment of the 6th zone in the diaspora appears to vindicate the global Pan-Africanist inspirations of 19th century Pan-Africanists. Williams, Du Bois, Cooper, as well as Nkrumah, and more recently Mbeki. If the AU were just a regional organization, the 5-zone continental Pan-African vision would have sufficed. Transatlantic and racialist Pan-Africanism had remained a legacy of memory that would be easily recultivated by Africans and African descendants in a globalizing world. In enacting the 6th zone, the AU would spread its tentacles to both a real and an imagined terrain referred to as Global Africa. So, contemporary routes of passage. To achieve this end, the AU would attempt to do two things. First, it would reconstruct a universal African identity among the geographically and socio-culturally diverse arena of peoples of Africa and its diaspora, who are already linked socially and culturally through complex networks of social relationships and processes. It would appear that after more than 200 years of sustained Pan-Africanism, the experiences of the dispersed peoples of Africa and their descendants remain multi-layered, interactively varied, complex, and constituted as well as mediated within an even wider and deeper global social ordering. The 6th zone will fulfill a second and rather more difficult function, the politicization of the diaspora. The diaspora clause extends institutionalized continental Pan-Africanism to the diaspora, thereby creating an international network of ideas and practices that can be positioned as a political body. How would the African Union imagine that it could cultivate universality and solidarity among such a broad, diverse, and complex scope and terrain? How would the Union address new notions of transnational citizenship claims vis-a-vis the African continent and its diaspora? St. Clair Drake argued that African worldview Pan-Africanism contains ontology to address these issues. This genre of Pan-Africanism carries with it the conscious understanding of African and African-descended peoples' identity in a larger worldview activity of continental and diaspora peoples who have obligations and responsibilities to each other. In establishing the sixth zone, the AU sculpts the deep-seated, multi-directional, hybrid cultural domains and networks of social relationships and processes to its own political ends. Like the continent, the diversity of the global diaspora implies that this process will be a challenge for the AU. Godfrey Mwaki Kajili reminds us that while Africans, African Americans, and Afro-Caribbeans are united by their common ancestry and their history of oppression and suffering under the European conquerors, these peoples also share conflict perceptions of each other that have emerged as a result of their separate historical experiences, as well as by the practice of colonialism and neocolonialism. Kwame Appiah suggests that the notion of Pan-Africanism cannot be assumed and must be cultivated. In both regards, as a result, Francis Korenge decries that the AU sixth zone and its African Diaspora consensus definition are too broad, bland, and do not recognize the diverse configurations of African descended peoples, nations, and communities in the diaspora. This problem may have caused the AU to miss the strategic and specific bounded units of global Africa. Additionally, Korenge argues that the Diaspora Clause does not seem to appreciate the range of ideological strains and the geocultural versus state versus non-state manifestations of Pan-Africanisms practiced around the globe. You see, this is my problem. We get all bogged down in all of this minutia, as opposed to just saying, and by the way, KW Don, this is why it's taking so long, right? As opposed to just saying, damn it, we're all African people. Let's get it. You feel me? We're all African people. Let's get it. KW Don doesn't remember the transvestite homophile. Okay, I'll look it up after the show. I was just hoping that you might know and could put it in the chat room to enlighten others, you know? The contemporary diaspora is a highly plural space that consists of a number of historical and geospatial experiential African descendant cultures. There is a historical diaspora community with its hegemonic concentration of African Americans in the USA, as well as the less powerful, though hugely populous Afro-Brazilian community. There are African descendant nation states such as Jamaica, Haiti, Trinidad, Guyana, Grenada, Barbados, and other Caribbean states with African descendant majority or minority populations. The diaspora also consists of a new constituent of post-colonial African immigrants who reside in the USA and in other formerly colonized or advanced industrial nations such as Great Britain, France, Belgium, Spain, and Germany. So now we get to part of the paper that's interestingly titled Pan-African Culture Wars. Pan-African Culture Wars. You guys, allow me to take a quick station ID break and I'll be back in just a second.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
This is DAX. You tune into the Harsh Reality Podcast, providing you with social commentary on the news affecting our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-black perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Yes, indeed. Make sure to check out KWAZ Radio, the YouTube channel. Make sure to subscribe to that channel. Click the bell to be notified when new content is posted over there. And then check out all those other shows on KWAZ Radio. tonight's show here, I don't have as many people live with me, but that's okay. I guess folks is watching the Snyder Cut of Justice League or watching Falcon and the Winter Soldier. Is that out today, or is that later tonight or tomorrow morning or something? So I guess folks is busy with those shows. KW Don 7 says Urugu and the rest of our enemies do not use the gradual method. Magu Fuli is gone under mysterious circumstances. Yeah, didn't our brother, wasn't he like he didn't believe, he was a COVID denier? Wasn't he a COVID denier and died from COVID? Ah, boy. So the Pan-African culture wars. The idea and practice of Pan-Africanism is as contested as it is cultivated in this global space. Multiple interpretations, iterations, and manifestations of Pan-Africanism have dispersed all over the global terrain. As the AU attempts to reconstruct its own philosophical strain and political brand of Pan-Africanism, it's not surprising that it encounters several roadblocks that challenge the full realization of global African unity. The challenges are myriad, with these stemming from political and epistemological discourse differences between A, Afrocentrists and Eurocentrists, B, Black nationalists and African nationalists, and C, diaspora nationalists and continental nationalists. Paul Gilroy's Atlanticist diaspora paradigm, represented in his classic work, The Black Atlantic, Modernity, and Double Consciousness, as well as Kwame Apia's In My Father's House. Both suggest one such tension in the Pan-African culture wars. Both are critical of the Asante style, African-centered genre of Pan-Africanism, describing it as an unwarrantedly purist, retrograde, essentialist, racialist, and an unrealistic transnational identity choice for African heritage communities in the diaspora. African descent peoples resident in the Americas and Europe would best claim Western civilization as integral to their global heritage. While Gilroy advocates on an emphasis on the mix, including Western cultural attributes and formations that have shaped African descendant identities in the West, Appiah suggests that it cannot be assumed that Africans in the continent necessarily adhere to a shared sense of Pan-African identity. Nonetheless, both simplify the concept of Pan-Africanism by relying on dualist binaries to formulate their thesis themselves. Both falsely posit Afrocentric Pan-Africanism as an essentialist monolithic identity and thereby misrepresent Pan-Africanism. Their analysis egregiously omit the complex pluralism that are embedded in Pan-Africanism's multiple strains, evident by our illustration of Pan-Africa's 6 global zones. Pan-Africanism and its current institutionalization and globalization by the AU emphasize this ontological pluralism, mixing and syncretism required to traverse, negotiate, absorb, and complement local global cultural encounters and contexts. The AU's historical Pan-Africanist focus need not be seen as foundationalist, as the authors claim. Instead, the AU's actions demonstrate that historical rendering is capable of producing knowledge about current conditions of African and African-descended peoples in ways that have important contemporary political implications. Another tension dividing the diasporas, the Afrocentrists and the Africanists, might be attributed to historiography rather than ideology. Patterson and Kelly inform us of the need to distinguish between the study of nationalisms and the study of diasporas. The former study, the study of nationalisms, belonging to the traditional preserve of political scientists' conceptual focus on states and institutions. The latter, the study of diasporas, explicitly belongs to the cultural studies domain with its focus on non-state actors and socio-cultural forces. This is all the mix-up stuff that just throws us off. It just throws us off. I'm not saying to disregard anyone. I'm not even saying to force anyone to do anything. But I am saying cut the bullshit and let's just get to work. Both divergent disciplinary mappings throw up different conceptual gazes. In Black Globalism, Sterling Johnson makes the most compelling case in revealing the non-state international politics of African Americans through Pan-Africanism. In the current essay, we have seen how the diaspora movement fostered cultural transatlantic Pan-Africanism and how it dominated the first 5 decades of the global movement. Nonetheless, phases 2, the Organization of African Unity, and 3, the African Union, Pan-Africanism, have been shaped by continental and national manifestations of state-centric and institutional Pan-Africanism advanced by African sovereign nations embarking upon collective nation-state action. I mean, you can't deny that is true, right? We see in the current essay as well as how the AU's state-centric Pan-Africanism is shaping socio-cultural processes in zones 1 through 6 to serve its own global ends as it strategically interweaves among several socio-political layers and negotiations and assemblage of symbolic traits, practices, cultural markers, and goods that embody African ideas, identities, and ideologies. It is in this regard that the AU meets its greatest challenges in attempting to establish and build a global nation out of a deeply diverse and sometimes divided Africana world. After all, it is one thing to use culture to facilitate political outcomes, as the AU is doing, but it is another to achieve political gains in the diaspora, using politics on its own terms. The AU has been less successful with this challenge of national sovereignty and citizenship, as the organization attempts to reconfigure and reclaim national sovereignty to achieve global political union and transnational citizenship. It is encountering significant obstacles in the diaspora territories. The union's institutional challenge remains its ability to successfully define and map out African diaspora citizenship rights in terms of national sovereignty, residency, and other entitlements. So I'll say this about that last line. This challenge, right, in the thinking that KW Dawn 7 has as well, this challenge has taken too long to fix. We could worry about residency and other entitlements later. Just the right to return home is something that the continent should be looking to do immediately for its people outside of the continent, right? Just to be able to return, just making it, pretty smooth, right, for us to return home. As me and KW Dawn 7 talked about in this show before, do something about the prices to travel to Africa, for example, for starters, right? there are things that you can do, you know what I'm saying? There's things that you can do if you really want to fix that challenge. If you want to meet that challenge, in my opinion, there's things that you could do that could have been done. The AU's global era, Pan-Africanism, practicing cultural politics but eluding political sovereignty. Global cultural politics in action. Despite the union's challenges in achieving a more concrete political and transnational unity, the emerging superstates practices in specific continental and diaspora locales around the world are evidence of its contribution to the statement of cultural globalization. These events that may be characterized as the AU's global era Pan-Africanism are worth illuminating and examining. In local, national, regional, and global contexts, the African Union is both exemplifying as well as fostering its cultural and socio-political agency. In these diverse contexts throughout global Africa, the super state can be seen to be creating, adapting, and reinventing cultural identities in congregates of global political power. This is how we see the AU's global era Pan-Africanism, whereby its diaspora clause is but one scenario through which the international organization is enacting its cultural global politics in the 21st century. The AU utilized a wide range of activities through which to achieve its goals in this regard, including the convening of annual meetings, sponsoring of academic conferences, holding continental-wide and transnational events, enacting numerous policy disseminated by communiques and press releases, and devolving its committee and subcommittee activities down to nations and localities and civil societal organizations. Like much of its constitutive act laws and policies, the diaspora clause itself has emerged as a result of a number of proceedings and conferences held in various countries in the continent as well as in the diaspora. New York City, Brazil, Trinidad and Tobago have been hosts to some of these conferences, which have been convened in the same fashion as the 20th century Pan-African Congresses. However, these 21st century Congresses are organized and attended by state and non-state actors, including state representatives, civil society organizations, and scholars from the continent and from the diaspora. There are numerous evidences documented of these kinds of activities. For example, in its attempt to recognize the diaspora in the Caribbean, the AU participates in state-to-state multilateral relations. It invited the Secretary General of the Caribbean Community, CARICOM, as well as special guests to its fifth ordinary session of Assembly to address the opening session. The CARICOM Secretary Generals designate affirmed the Caribbean's approval to quote-unquote involve the representatives of the Caribbean diaspora in deliberations in the Economic, Social, and Cultural Council, the Civil Society Advisory Group. Meetings between CARICOM representatives and AU members have also taken place in Mozambique and Nigeria, aimed at deepening connections between the regions through exploring and developing approaches to common challenges and issues. While CARICOM has been an important institution representing the diaspora in the Caribbean, the United States has seen similar relations emerging between the AU and the country's African diaspora, especially through non-state actors. Author and activist Herb Boyd emphasized the importance of unity between the diaspora and the African Union in the African American New York-based newspaper, New York Amsterdam News. In December 2010, at the City College of New York, the college's Black Studies Department and the African Union Diaspora Task Team held a town meeting. This meeting served as a forum for civil society groups to engage with the ambassador of the African Union to the United States to develop a framework for better organization of the diaspora, enhancing relations between between them and the AU. Key speakers at the meeting spoke of the importance of the AU's initiative, referencing the intellectual influences of Kwame Nkrumah, Marcus Garvey, and W.E.B. Du Bois. Pan-Africanist six-zone encounters. These AU diaspora meetings constitute sites of analysis for examining the AU's cultural global politics in a more introspective manner. The meetings operate as encounters that provide us with representations of cultural tropes where discourses and dialogues among a diverse range of Africans and African-descended peoples and socio-political movements are involved with the construction and reconstruction of ideas that become the essential impetus of political decision-making. For example, in 2005, the AU posted the first round of its minutes concerning the deliberations on the Diaspora Clause as, quote, Decision 164, Decision on the Definition of the African Diaspora, end of quote, as follows. Decision on the Definition of the African Diaspora, document EXCL 164, the Executive Council, number 1, takes note of the definition of the African diaspora as proposed by the Commission. 2, requests the Commission to refer the issue to a meeting of experts from member states for a more suitable definition. 3, further requests the chairperson of the Commission, in consultation with the chairperson of the Union, to determine the appropriate date for including ECO SOCC, taking into account the requests in paragraph 2 above. Decision 164 had evolved from earlier AU deliberations on this topic in Trinidad and Tobago by experts from the continent from the diaspora in June 2004. A previous recommendation of the definition of diaspora had been rejected by the AU Executive Committee's Permanent Representatives Committee, PR, because it had not included the so-called modern diaspora. The committee felt that it was not inclusive. Another reason that it was not accepted was the clause's failure to include the notion of what later became known as the African cause in its narrative. Here, the PRC emphasized that the diaspora should include African-descended people who were willing to be part of the continent. The final derivation of the Diaspora Clause emerges from this series of deeply engaging discussions and engage of views similar to the one that had occurred in Trinidad and Tobago on a range of interpretations of Pan-Africanism. The report records the following broad definitions by delegates present. The African diaspora includes the peoples of African origin, whose ancestors within historical memory came from Africa, but who are currently domiciled in other countries outside the continent and claim citizenship of those countries. Which one of these definitions do you guys gel with the most? The Africans who, for various reasons, have settled outside the continent, whether or not they have kept their citizenship of an African country. A third one, within the context of A and B above, the diaspora, in their relations with Africa, should also express their common will to contribute side by side with other citizens of Africa to the building of the African nation. These early definitions were still These early definitions were still metamorphed by subsequent deliberations, which synthesized the Addis Ababa definitions into the current consensus definition, which now represents the Diaspora Clause, or Article 3C of the AU's Constitutive Act. Quote, to invite and encourage the full participation of the diaspora as an important part of our continent to build the African Union. I can get down with that. The definitional changes which emerge as a result of sustained and diverse participation deliberations reveal that Africans and African descendants understand the complex and divergent historical trajectories that inform the diversity of the African diaspora. What's more, while it is assumed that the AU's Diaspora Clause has an instrumental goal to capitalize on remittance investments from new African diasporas. The diaspora deliberations tell us that the inclusion of the modern diaspora was in fact an afterthought. The diaspora clause emerges as a result of the AU's sustained cultivation of long-standing social capital relations with historic diaspora communities, with descendant communities as the main target, as well as the final consensus decision has been a shared formulation by diaspora participants. The same process is occurring in other diaspora contexts. In 2006, the African Union and the government of Brazil hosted an international conference of Africans and Africans in the diaspora in Salvador, Brazil. The meeting was attended by the then chairperson of the African Union, 6 African heads of states, the Prime Minister of Jamaica, Lula, former president of Brazil, a number of AU governmental officials, civil societal groups, and especially notable scholars from the diaspora, from the continent. Scholars of Afro-Brazilians attended the conference, whose goal sought to facilitate a partnership between Africans and Africans in the diaspora. One participant called this the third stage of the African Diaspora Partnership, which would focus on the institutionalization of discussions, debates, and negotiations between Africans and its descendant peoples. What's all these discussions and negotiations and debates for? Institutionalization was seen to be the vehicle that would foster strength and partnerships among these heritage peoples in ways that culminated what many participants at the conference proclaimed would be a mutual goal to unite Africa. One of the conference respondents commended the AU's conferences and meetings, especially when they are held in Latin America, where the diaspora contributions to the histories of these societies are only just beginning to be unearthed. Finally, ensuring that a diaspora policy includes only those committed to the African cause demonstrate that there exists a sustained Pan-African political consciousness evident in the AU's deliberations regarding its global outreach to the diaspora. The insistence of including only those who are committed to the African cause suggests that including the diaspora in the building of a united and developed Africa is the diaspora's cause's ultimate goal, as declared in the AU's Constituent Act of 2002. The enactment of the Diaspora Clause as AU policy and the discourse tropes that have contributed to this reality represent merely one strain that demonstrate the process of AU's practice of global cultural politics. It is the AU's implementation of the Diaspora Act and its institutionalization of the clause broadly and deeply in scope that will measure the African impact on globalization. In this regard, the AU will use 2 of its institutional bodies to achieve its goal to shape global African unity: ECOSOCC and CIDO. Economic, Social, and Cultural Council, right, which is the former, was established in 2005 to foster the building of partnerships between African states and African civil societies. Article 3 of the statutes of the African Union bylaws state that the ECOSOCC shall also include social and professional groups in the African diaspora organizations. 20 diaspora organizations will be part of the AU's ECOSOCC, the advisory civil society body of the African Union. The African Union Commission's Citizens and Diasporas Directorate, CIDO, is an institutional body where the AU manifests its diaspora initiative. CIDO's goal is to hold regular dialogues with diaspora communities around the world. All right, we get it. We get it. You plan to do a lot of talking, so-called engaging, right? And that's whatever. The mixture of old and new diaspora civil societal groups were reported to have attended the meetings, some of which included African Unity of Harlem, Youth Icons, African Cultural Exchange Club, the December 12th Movement, African Sun Times, Falu Foundation, the Drama Institute, African Poetry Theater Inc., Cameroon Organization, World African Diaspora Union, Gullah Geechee Nation, shout out to them, the Africa Channel, Sage Africa, and the 6th Region Diaspora Caucus, to name a few. The AU initiated its first consultation of the African Diaspora of the African Union at its headquarters in downtown New York, entitled Building Bridges Across the Atlantic, a two-way conference occurring on October 21st to 22nd. Okay, that's cool. The Diaspora Clause provides evidence and illustrates a significant way that the African Union participates, shapes, and advances the project of cultural globalization through Pan-Africanism. Through the enactment of the clause of political action, the AU proceeds to utilize cultural politics to achieve its means. It does so by cultivating state, regional, civil societal partnerships throughout the Africa and the diaspora, and it uses Pan-Africanism as a cultural artifact to shape perceptions and forge identities among the inhabitants of these regions. The events and activities that the AU organizes constitute examples of the international institution's deep immersion and the full enactment of its goals to reinvent a notion of global Africa. So we're finally at the conclusion of this paper. I know it's kind of dragged on, but I appreciate all of you who are here and you guys who participated in today's show. Let's get to this conclusion. We could wrap it up for tonight. Towards the illusion of a transnational African citizenship. Using Pan-Africanism to redistrict Africa into 5 zones and to enact the diasporan 6th zone in vacuous global space are actions that support the reality that African continental initiatives are contributing to globalization using cultural politics. As to cultivate 6 zones out of an entire globe of multiply constituted hybrid socio-cultural and political diaspora domains, the AU's Pan-Africanism strategically excavates the long-standing, deeply historical, and broadly global roots that precede its current organizational manifestation. The Pan-Africanist movement underlies the ideological and cultural framework that the AU uses to legitimize its contemporary continental and global actions. Using Pan-Africanism as a symbolic marker to reinvent outward notions of place for Africans and her descendants in the global arena, the Diaspora Clause supports a notion that continental Africans not only possess a deeply seated public memory of a diaspora cultural consciousness, but they continue to participate in the reintegration and transposition of what have historically been cultural Pan-Africanist initiatives into direct global political action. The AU's state-centric global diasporic initiatives may or may not turn out to be more consequential than the cultural surges and informal ebbs and flows of non-state actors of the past, who, while certainly have legitimately kept shared identities alive over time, have been unable to use the power of the state, political institutions, and global governance bodies to enact a lasting and broadly penetrating institutionalization of Pan-Africanism in ways that the African Union is attempting to achieve. Be that as it may, however, the full realization of the AU's Pan-Africa goals remains shrouded in political ambiguities and contradictions of the rights of transnational citizenship and political sovereignty. Does a concept of AU citizenship exist in Africa or the diaspora? Will Pan-Africans be conferred with political rights and obligations? And these are good questions, by the way, right? Because again, you know, that that also drives people's participation in this thing, right? You would want to know, let's say, because even if you talk like repatriation, right? You would want to know if you have political rights when you repatriate. Would your voice be heard? Would your needs be met? Would you have the opportunity to elect folks whose promises align with your interests? While the superfluity of culture makes it easy to cultivate shared identities, political questions shrouded in the reality of territorial reality and citizenship still evade the AU's pan-national unity goals. To date, only West Africa, through KWAZ, has come closest to the political ideals of union with the current adoption of the single KWAZ passport. Moreover, Ghana is the only continental African Union member that has taken steps to formulate a diaspora citizenship law in its national constitution. Perhaps, and that could be, I think that's a big part of when I was talking to Obadeli Cambone, why folks should choose Ghana to repatriate to. Perhaps the value of the African Union may be its cultural politics rather than a rigid form of sovereign politics. Universal involvement and participation in the African Union may remain configured in a transnational, non-legal construct where states and particularly non-state actors in the continent and the diaspora play a voluntary role based on their shared cultural experience. Perhaps it will be the onus of African and African descended states, peoples, and non-state forces to respond to the AU's constitutive act proactively in the diversity of matters that they may choose to contribute while maintaining national sovereign citizenships. These questions remain the preserve of the future. In the meantime, the idea of a 2025 suprastate, an African nation that the AU claims that it will evolve to become in the future, and which now includes the sixth zone African descendant diaspora, is rooted in historic aspirations of African and African descended peoples. Currently, the AU is a vehicle through which Africans are marking their own impact on globalization as they forge a transcultural social network of African values, identities, and cultures, embodied in the symbol of Pan-Africa for African and African descendants. The Pan-Africanist unity vision is alive and well in the present. Moreover, it remains an aspiration that this emerging global governance actor, Africa's African Union, does not shy away from cultivating into a more concrete reality in the future. And that's our paper. It's a long paper. I knew that going in, but I thought it was an important paper to get an idea of what is the vision from the continental side of Africa's people outside of the continent. I see Zuliism is with us. I didn't know you were here. Zuliism says we have no friends. Thomas Sankara is king. Zuliism, do me the favor of expanding on those ideas before I bounce off of it. When you say we have no friends, after I read a paper about the continent, including the diaspora, right? Diasporans, African diasporans in the sixth zone, right? Are you saying that we, those of us outside of Africa, have no friends on the continent? And then you said Thomas Sankara is king. Let me know what you mean by Thomas Sankara is king. While Gunnar answers that question for me, I'll extend to the rest of you. What were your thoughts on the paper? What are your thoughts on the 6th Zone and the African Union in terms of a Pan-African ideology that includes those of us from the 6th Zone? What do you guys think of that? What do you guys think of the paper? And Gunnar, if you could just briefly expand upon what you're saying, I'll read that on the air on the other side. I'm going to take a quick station ID break, and I'll be right back.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
This is DAX. You tune into the Harsh Reality Podcast, providing you with social commentary on the news affecting our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-black perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
All right. As I wait for that answer, I'm going to go on mute for one quick second. I'll be back in a minute. Okay, let's see what's going on in the chat room. In the chat room, Erzulism says Asians, Europeans, and other races are only trying to exploit Africa. The diaspora is programmed by European ideas. So how can we help the continent if we come in with? I guess I'll let him finish that thought. You're right though. You're right, and it's a proximity issue too, right? Like, by proximity I mean a time issue. Like, independence, as I was corrected in the last episode, right? If Jamaica and Trinidad were like the first two Caribbean nations to get independence, we're just talking like 62, 64, somewhere around there, right? The Bahamas is, I think, the 4th nation that got independence. I mean, notwithstanding Haiti that got independence in 1804, of course, right? But when you look at the nations, I mean, some of these nations are literally just around 50 years old, 55 years old. And so a lot of people who were in fact young adults when these nations got independence, who came up under British or French rule or whatever, they still have some of that mentality. I remember arguing with a lady from my hometown about that years ago, who was proud of her quote unquote British heritage. And I'm like, for what? Right? Azulism says Thomas Sankara kicked everybody out and said we're doing it the African way. We have to reject all teaching that contradict nature or Africa. Do me a favor and post in the chat room what happened to Thomas Sankara for me, Azulism. But I agree. I mean, is Africa a bust at this point? Either we're gonna do it the African way or we're gonna drown. Right? Either we float doing it the African way or we sink. By the way, if you're listening and not participating in the chat room, please do hit the like button. All the likes do help this small channel as we're trying to grow it, trying to get more people to check us out. And if you don't mind, please share the content that you find on the channel that you find interesting. I know a lot of people like the conversation I had the other day about the Monroe Doctrine as it applies to Haiti. You know, share that with your people, share that with your folks. Anyway, y'all, I've been on here 2.5 hours for this paper. I appreciate all of you. Shout out to Zuliism. Shout out to KW Don 7. Shout out to Kevin Care 42. Shout out to Black Excellence for being here today. And you know, making this a good episode from a paper that was pretty lengthy. You guys still made it a good episode. I see Azuliism says if we come in with capitalist and communism ideologies, we're only going to help European pockets. Thomas got killed by his right-hand man. Absolutely. Yes, KW Don 7 says it again. Sankara was betrayed by his right-hand man like Lumumba. Yes. That's why I said to post it, because, listen, one of the reasons why Africa suffers so much from poor leadership is because the right people for the job, men and women, are oftentimes too afraid now to take up that job. Like KW Don 7 and I said earlier, if you look back at Lumumba, when Lumumba started talking about nationalizing the resources and keeping resources for Africans, etc., those white guys in that documentary, and you guys should check out the Discord where I have that documentary as well, and the conscious videos. You guys will see these white boys was dead serious. He signed his debt warrant that day. You know? So, you know, this is the problem we have. We have a problem, and this is why, for those who are not familiar with Azuliism, this is why Azuliism usually says, yo, we're screwed. As people, we're screwed because, you know, we're dealing with a savage enemy who has the ability to create turncoats in our society. They'll get your right-hand man to put you down, you know, and that's a harsh reality that we have. You could build the greatest army, right? But if the army is full of people who are willing to turn coat for a European coin, that army won't be great for so long. And so I don't have the answers. I'm hoping that over the course of the next few years, you and I on this show and our discussions can figure out something that can be done. But whatever it is, and this goes back KW Don 7 to the idea of gradualism, whatever it is, the problem is that you won't be able to implement that today. Even if we came up with something tonight, you won't be able to implement that today. That's our problem. We would have to teach our future generations towards that concept. And that's kind of where we stand, and that's where we've been for the longest while. It's just unfortunate, but we got to get to the point where we just won't sell our people out. And how do you get a people to commit to not selling their people out when the offer might be 5 million, 10 million, 20 million, right? When the offer might be, I'll give you power where you could call the shots and make however much million you want to make. Once you do what we do, and if you don't do it, we'll come and we'll take you out. You know, so it's a heavy problem. But again, I don't want to extend this podcast for too long. I don't want to scare people off from listening or watching this episode. Again, I thank all of you that I thanked before. I'll be back again on Saturday. I'm going to try to come with a bit of a lighter paper, but you know, something that we could sink our teeth into at the same time and get good participation. So you guys make sure click the bell to be notified when I'm on again on Saturday. And until next time, guys, thanks again. I'll talk to you soon. Peace.
Thanks for listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast with your host, Koku. If you like what you just heard, we hope you pass along our web address, bittermedicineblogs.com, to your friends and colleagues, and share our show to all your social media. Be sure to check out our archive section on our website for previous podcasts. This has been a KWAZ radio production. Join us next time for another session of the Bitter Medicine Podcast. Follow us on Facebook at Bitter Medicine Show, Twitter, Bitter Meds, Tumblr, Bitter Meds, Instagram, Bitter Medicine.